then I decided to do, together with guidance with a dear friend of mine, a psychedelic assisted journey. And it gave me this incredible connection to life and source and everything that's around us, because I really got back to source. I saw myself be born again. I felt every cell of my body, and I also saw myself die. And in that, I found this enormous peace. And I realized that, we struggle so much to live because we are a culture that is so fearful of dealing with death, right? We don't even want to talk about it. And in that denial, we can't fully live, right? And there's something about coming to terms with that, even having a felt experience and realizing that it's not so horrible, that then makes us come back and be able to appreciate life even more, right? So I think that's kind of where my journey started, with the different modalities.
Thomas, I am so excited to talk to you. I feel like before we even officially got started, we already started talking about things that we're both into. So I'm like, this is going to be such a great conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited about sharing, this new field of discovery, and also how it can really impact people's lives, right? Because I think
Yeah.
there's still not a lot of awareness about this. So I'm really looking forward to this as well.
I mean, you are in such a unique space. You are somebody who has experience as a couples therapist. So you know about
Mhm.
attachment theory, you know about intimacy, you know about relationships, but then you also do this work with psychedelics and making sure that people are using them in your retreats in a responsible way that can help with emotional healing and can help with, I believe there was like somatic work. There were so many different strings being
Yes.
connected there. So
Yes.
I think maybe the easiest way for us to start is just, where did this journey begin for you?
Yeah, I just want to say very quickly to what you said before, because you are right. I do a lot of different things. And the reason for that is that I think, especially in Western society, we had this fragmented view of the human organism. Like, we have talk therapy, which
Yeah.
is very cognitive, right? And we often
Yeah.
forgot that we are a full organism that cooperate together for us to stay in balance. And unless we're in balance, we
Yeah.
can't fully relate to others. So unless we involve the body in this work as well, we're missing out a huge
Hmm.
part, right? That I think we're often very disconnected from. But to your question about how did this journey start? Well, it started many, many years ago. But I think when it really took
Yeah.
off for me was when I separated from a long-term partner. And I remember
Yeah.
picking up this book called Hold Me Tight, by the way, by Sue Johnson. And it talked
Mm.
about attachment theory and how these different safety strategies got in the way of us relating, these adaptive strategies that we learned very early based on how our caregiving was, right? And
Mhm.
suddenly it was almost like being in the movie The Matrix. I could just see everything that had gone wrong with every relationship I ever had,
Yeah.
and it created this huge overflow in my body of compassion towards myself, towards my ex-partners, because often we get stuck in this blame. We want to find the bad guy or the bad woman. We want to find somebody we can push the blame on, right? Either
Yeah.
ourselves or the other. But when I read this, I realized there's nobody to blame. It's just a lack of awareness of these patterns that we are continuously playing out again and again. And it created this sense of freedom. And then, of course, I studied in emotional focused couple therapy, which is basically a therapy using attachment theory. And I started,
Yeah.
of course, reaping the benefits myself in my own relationship, but also seeing the impact it can have on other people, to actually be
Yeah.
able to understand these fundamental needs that we all have, right? And then I think
Yeah.
psychedelics really came into the picture, because I had a beautiful boy who is now 12, and he was born with a life-limited condition, and he was given a week to live. And he's the first child in the world to survive being born with no short gut, which is what we need to absorb
Mm.
food. So that obviously was a huge journey. Um, and I was stuck in this constant, I guess, middle path between part of me wanted to love him fully, and part of me was too fearful to love somebody that potentially I'm going to lose, right? And I couldn't really come to terms with that, despite all my training in somatic trauma therapy, couple therapy. And
Yeah.
then I decided to do, together with guidance with a dear friend of mine, a psychedelic assisted journey. And
Hmm.
it gave me this incredible connection to life and source and everything that's around us, because I really got back to source. I saw myself be born again. I felt every cell of my body. And I also saw myself die. And in that, I
Mm.
found this enormous peace. And I realized that, we struggle so much to live because we are a culture that is so fearful of dealing with death, right? We don't even want to talk
Yeah.
about it. And in that denial, we can't fully live. right? And there's
Mhm.
something about coming to terms with that, even having a felt experience and realizing that it's not so horrible, that then makes us come back and be able to appreciate life even more, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of where my journey started with the different modalities.
That is phenomenal. I mean, first of all, I just want to hold space for a moment just for the absolutely phenomenal journey that you've been on, that I can tell the joy that you have now that you're able to speak about some very difficult moments with such grace. I mean, that shows just how much transformation you've gone through. And I what I'm I'm kind of blown away for a moment here, but now what I want to say is that the string that I'm now seeing between all of the work that you do is, it sounds like it's about dropping fear and embracing, maybe intimacy is a word I know we heard before, but also just kind of like connecting to our core. And I would love to just kind
Yes.
of, reflect that back to you and see if that's kind of an accurate way to look at all of the work you do.
It is, because I think often we really overcomplicate it because we all love to feel like we're
Yeah.
experts and really smart, right? So we try and intellectualize it and create all these theories. So I can say I'm an expert in X, Y, and Z, and I have a PhD,
Yeah.
and then our ego
Yeah.
feels really good, right? And I
Yeah.
think, part of the beauty in this is that it's very, very simple. What gets in
Yeah.
the way of us connecting with other human beings is always a fear response. It is the only
Yeah.
thing that blocks us from truly connecting with other human beings. And even when we are talking about the bin and arguing over who should take the bin out, it's fundamentally someone saying, I feel alone, or I don't feel
Yeah.
supported. So it's an underlying safety need that's not being met. And, I think there's this misconception again, and Hollywood is very much to blame for part of this, because Hollywood has created this romanticized idea of intensity, right? Of
Yes.
intensity is love. And that's now what we all go out and seek, right? When we go out date, we
Right.
want to feel that enormous spark. But what we have failed to grasp is that intensity, and we even know this because they scanned brains of people falling in love, is
Yeah.
similar to the brain chemistry of addiction. And this is important to understand. And actually, it's the same
Yeah.
parts that are active in people that have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is why people
Sure.
often say, oh, I can't stop thinking about this person. It's not
Right.
love,
Right.
it's obsession. And I tell you why
Yeah.
this is important to understand, because, I've also had, clients come who had been in abusive relationships. And what tend to happen was that there's a very intensity in the beginning, and then it's
Yeah.
spread in with anxiety. And then comes the
Mm.
nice part again, right? And this hit of up and down, you know what that reminds us of? Addiction, right?
Addiction.
I feel
Yeah.
good when I take a bit of heroin, it feels amazing. And then next day I come
Right.
down. The opposite. Love is not about that. Love is
Yeah.
about stable, consistent care and responsiveness and safety. And then, yes, then we can
Yeah.
add all the fun stuff. And the amazing thing
Right.
was, we even found in research that when, this idea that I have to be anxious, etc., to be exciting is not true. The couples
Right.
reporting the best sex lives long term are people that
Yeah.
have a secure attachment dynamic, right?
Right. Right. So, but why is it then that for some of us, we view that stability as boring? We can't, so for a lot of us, we don't see that as desirable. We see that as, oh, this is
Mm.
dull, this is boring. If we see a couple walking down the street that just seem secure but aren't madly falling over each other all the time, we don't really look at that as desirable.
Yes, and that is spot on, and that's a super good question. So it's because, and this is interesting because as mammals, and we are a mammal, we are the
Yes.
slowest of all of mammals to develop. Right? We take about 18 years until we are self-sufficient, while most
Yes.
mammals are sufficient in a couple of weeks, months, maximum
Yes.
years. They can live on their own.
Yep.
That's because we were designed biologically to also be the most adaptable. Right. So we
Yeah.
were mostly adaptable to environment for survival. And what that means, if you look at our culture, from the moment we start here, we are primed for quick stimulation. Look at how most kids grow up today. They constantly have a
Yeah.
phone. They go
Oh,
through
yeah.
social media. So they get a constant dopamine rush, meaning the
Yeah.
brain get addicted to not be able to be in stillness and actually
Yeah.
enjoying the slowness of stability. It's actually being primed constantly to need this
Yeah.
constant dopamine hit, which is exactly what you get with what you call a really exciting partner, right? That, oh, this
Yeah.
is amazing. You get a huge dopamine hit, and that's your brain rewarding you to say, go get more. And we are
Yeah.
conditioning the brain of generations now to be responsive to need quick dopamine hits. This is why we buy so much
Mm.
stuff. The second we don't
Yeah.
feel good, what do we try to do? We try and create a
Yeah.
good feel by go shopping, because shopping gives us a boost of dopamine. My mom used to
Right.
study, she was a professor at the business school in Copenhagen and studied sociology. An interesting part of the whole fundamental structure we live in is the fact that it's primed for us to not feel good, because capitalism
Right.
flourish when we feel isolated and alone, because then we purchase more. And when we
Yes.
shame women about how they look, they also spend more money, right?
Yes.
Even think
Yes.
about makeup. For that industry to exist, there was no survival need for it. They had to first make
Right.
women feel bad about how they looked, and then they had
Right.
something to sell to solve that problem. And at some point, it
Yes.
becomes what's called a reinforcing strategy, meaning women reinforce it themselves on each other, right? By criticizing each
Yes.
other, by judging each other. And it's, the biggest marketing, successful marketing strategy in history. But we have to stop and ask, is this serving us? Yeah.
Right.
Is this
Right.
serving us? And even your attachment strategy has a lot to do with what you are attracted to, right? So I will have
Right.
people coming to me, and primarily women, but it can also be men, that have an anxious attachment style. Maybe they had a father who weren't responsive to them or abandoned them,
Mm.
and they have a lot of worry about abandonment. They people please a lot, they ruminate a lot, which is classical symptoms
Yeah.
of anxious attachment. And what they do psychologically, unaware, they're not aware of this, they do something called
Mm-hmm.
reenactment. So they go look for avoidant men, because in the
Ah.
hope that they can change them and get a completion to the narrative they didn't get as a child. Of course, this
Wow.
never works in real life. It just causes ongoing frustration and more hurt, right? Again and again,
Right.
because they then
Right.
get a man that doesn't respond to them, and they try to change this man, and it's not working, right? But it's
Right.
that inner child desperately trying to turn around a man that's not responsive into a man that's responsive, except it's
Yeah.
never solved playing this out in a dating life. It's solved by going in and looking at these fundamental wounds that happen at a young age. And when you do that, you know what happens? Suddenly they're not
Mm.
attracted to those men anymore. And it's super fascinating to watch. And I've
Yeah.
seen it after psychedelic therapy, which also we now know can actually heal and change anxious attachment into a more
Wow.
secure. They simply don't find these men attractive anymore. They actually find them quite off putting. Right. So
Yeah.
what we find attractive and stimulated by can actually change as our own nervous system change.
Yeah. So it sounds like when we have that deep healing, when we heal the nervous system, when we heal the inner child, when we heal the shadow, however we want to put it, then all of a sudden we find that shift in our attachment style. So which then ripples out into what we're attracted to. I love this, but I guess maybe let's double back a little bit and just talk about attachment theory in general, because any of us who are addicted to our phones, addicted to the internet, we see this thrown around all the time. We hear about attachment theory. I've been hearing about it for years, but no one's really just explained what is it? What is attachment theory and what are the attachment styles?
Yes, let's go over that. That's a really good question. So I think
Yeah.
attachment styles is a fundamental survival strategy. As I said, we come in at a really young age, almost a blank
Yeah.
slate, and now
Yeah.
this organism have to adapt to its environment, right? So what
Yeah.
happened is that organism learned very quickly some strategies that can become very fixed and then continue to play out. And the strategies that we
Mm.
tend to have are quite simple. There's four main categories that they have found that they could see in infants, that they would pretty much always play out one of these four, right? So the
Mm.
first one is, for the ones of us that has been very lucky and had very attuned parents that was really responsive, is secure attachment. And how
Yeah.
that normally shows in a person that have secure attachment is that they're both very comfortable being on their own, but they are also very comfortable being in intimacy. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're not afraid of being alone and being abandoned. They're also not afraid of coming close to somebody and giving themselves to
Yeah.
somebody, right? They're comfortable
Yeah.
in both. They are quite good at asking and expressing their needs, because they have learned as a child to anticipate, hey, people are going to respond to my needs. People are going to
Yeah.
respond to my boundaries. They tend to not people please, because again, they have been respected their boundaries by their parents, right? So they
Sure.
have a good framework for what they anticipate. And they tend to be quite more stable. They can regulate themselves much easier. They deal much better with stress. They have a higher tolerance
Mm-hmm.
of stress, etc. And then we have the
Mm-hmm.
more anxious strategies, and there's three different categories within these. And what I just want to say before mentioning this, if listeners
Mm-hmm.
identify with this, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It's really
Yeah.
important to say. And also, your
Yeah.
attachment style does not define who you are, and they're changeable.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to say that, so people don't start feeling bad if they identify with some of this, right? So
Sure.
of the three anxious attachment style, we have first one, what is called anxious attachment. And anxious
Mm-hmm.
attachment was a child that started fearing abandonment. So again, that
Mm.
could have been maybe one of the parents left, maybe one of the parents died, whatever might have happened, right? They started to
Mhm.
fear that they couldn't consistently trust that people would stay in their lives. And that
Mm.
caused a sense of worry that you will be abandoned. And it tends to
Yeah.
come out when people are not aware of these fears and can't express them in good, vulnerable ways. It comes out of criticism, lashing out at a partner for maybe
Yeah.
not responding quickly enough or whatever they need, right? So it
Mhm.
comes out in these attacks that create dynamics that doesn't work very well. They tend to, I don't like the word needy because it feels very judgmental. And I don't think
Mm.
that's helpful for trying to heal these strategies. And there's a reason
Mhm.
people have these needs, right? But they
Sure.
require a lot of reassurance. They tend to use a survival strategy called fawn, which also is called people pleasing in normal language,
Mhm.
meaning they
Sure.
have learned that I have to accommodate myself to other people to be safe, to get response, right? And that
Yeah.
often means people get really drained over time. They get resentful because they do a lot of things they don't really want to do, instead of just
Sure.
saying, actually, I don't want to do this, right? And they're worried that
Mhm.
people will abandon them if they say, I don't like to do this. I don't like this kind of sex. I don't want to do whatever it is, right? They don't want to do.
Yeah.
Um, and they tend to ruminate a lot when relationship stops. They have self-blame because that's what the
Mm.
child did. When a child is abandoned, they can't understand what happened. So a child always internalize blame. And that's what you see with anxious attachment. When their partner leave,
Mm.
even if their partner has been very unpleasant, they will internalize and think, maybe I should have done this. Maybe it was because I
Right.
didn't do this. Maybe it wasn't.
Right.
And they will just ruminate and go over and over again, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find a way to, how was this my fault, in the hope that they can
Mhm.
predict and ensure it doesn't happen. Then we have
Yeah.
what is referred to as avoidant attachment. And both
Mhm.
men and women have that, but it shows up a bit more predominant in men, I think,
Mhm.
because of our culture. So what
Yeah.
this is a child, there used to be this time where we said, oh, if kids cry, let them cry it out. Otherwise, they don't learn to look out
Mhm.
for themselves.
Right.
Now we know
Right.
from science today, this is nonsense. And it was really bad
Yes.
advice, because what
Yeah.
happened is a small child can't regulate its own nervous system. It simply
Right.
can't. It hadn't developed that capacity neurologically. So
Mhm.
arousal goes up and up and up to the point where it actually becomes life threatening. The blood pressure will keep
Mhm.
rising. So the only
Mhm.
strategy that child can do, if the parents just keep ignoring it, is to suppress the impulse.
Yeah.
And that child now learn, nobody's going to respond to my needs anyway. And what
Right.
does that do? It creates somebody who is afraid and don't like intimacy, because why would you, if you
Mm.
anticipate your partner is never going to respond to your needs anyway? It's somebody
Right.
who's not in touch with their needs. It's somebody who's very individualistic. They seem very confident. They always talk about
Mhm.
independence, right? Independence,
Right.
independence. If they're
Right.
stressed, they always need their own space. They don't seek co-regulation, for example, from their
Mhm.
partner. They prefer to go deal with it themselves. They don't want to
Yeah.
express anything vulnerable, because, again, why would you? If you learned people
Yeah.
close to me are not going to respond anyway, right? So
Yeah.
that create this avoidant behavioral strategy that, again, they play out because what happened as a child they anticipate will happen in the
Yeah.
future. That's how the organism works. And the last of the four, which is the one primarily associated with very severe trauma, is what's called
Mm.
disorganized. And
Yeah.
that tend to show up in a behavior of mixed of extreme anxious attachment and extreme avoidant, meaning they will be very intense in the beginning. When you meet them, they will text you
Yeah.
all the time. They will want to see, or they'll want closeness really quickly. The second you
Yeah.
reciprocate, they panic and they become extreme avoidance, and they will completely push you
Yeah.
away, disengage.
Yeah.
And for a regulated person, this will be so confusing. They'll be like, what's happening, right? And then if you
Yeah.
pull away, they will come close again. And when you then meet them, they will
Mm.
push you away. So it's people who crave intimacy, but at the same time is terrified of it because they were
Yeah.
obviously somehow violated at a young age, right? So these are the
Yeah.
four key strategies.
Wow. I wanted, first of all, thank you for giving such a thorough explanation. That really clarified a lot of things that I wasn't um, clear about before. I think what's also great about your explanation is that you do validate that these attachment styles did come from somewhere. I think a lot of the times when we read about this, it's always like, oh, we're defective. There's something wrong with us. But you're saying, no, there was something legitimately that
Yes.
happened to us, usually in childhood, that caused this.
Yes.
So if someone discovers what their attachment style is, they say, okay, I know I'm avoidant, I know I'm disorganized. How then can you or someone like you then help them with their relationship once they know their attachment style?
That's a really good question. And I'm happy you bring
Yeah.
this up, because I think the
Yeah.
first step is meeting self with a sense of compassion. And
Yeah.
just like you said, there's a reason we have these. And actually, nobody is broken. Nobody is
Yeah.
dysfunctional. I would even
Yeah.
say we had functional responses to dysfunctional environments. It
Yes.
was the
Yes.
environment that was dysfunctional, not the human being. However,
Yeah.
because a child can't understand that, it'll always internalize shame. So the child will always say,
Yeah.
my parents split up because of me. X, Y, and Z
Mhm.
happened because of me. So
Yeah.
that will also often show up in this self-critical, which is very typical of the more anxious attachment styles, right? So the
Yeah.
first part is to recognize you had a healthy survival response to a dysfunctional
Mhm.
environment. So there's nothing wrong with
Mhm.
you. I think
Yeah.
that's really number
Yeah.
one, right? Because then we can start being kind. And when we are kind, it becomes possible to look what is the needs that are hiding underneath, right? So
Yeah.
the anxious might say, oh, I'm not a clingy, critical human being. These are my
Yeah.
survival strategies. And now I'm aware of this. I recognize what I need is reassurance. And I need
Yeah.
a partner who is able to do that, because then my nervous system will slowly start to feel more and more safe, right? An
Yeah.
interesting thing, if you give that person that, guess what happens? The
Mhm.
criticism goes away, because
Yeah.
the criticism isn't needed anymore when that fundamental need is met, right?
Yeah.
So I think that number one is start with having a sense of self-compassion, as you said, understanding that these happened for a good reason, and they were even healthy responses that no longer serve us. You know,
Yeah.
I use the analogy that we can take these protective strategies and we can thank them, maybe even write a
Yeah.
letter to them and express your
Mm.
gratitude because they kept you alive. They did keep you alive, these strategies.
Yeah.
And then say, now is time to send them on holiday or retirement because they worked really, really hard, right? Send them
Yeah.
off on a well-paid retirement to Hawaii because you don't need it anymore, right? And
Yeah.
it really worked hard. It worked hard for you. And then I think,
Yeah.
then we have to remember, and this is what's really counterintuitive in this individualistic culture we have, that have
Yeah.
glorified individuality, that we are born as social beings. Our whole organism is wired for social connection. We need other
Yeah.
people from the day we are born to the day we
Yeah.
die. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's an acceptance in that, and recognizing, instead of glorifying that I can do everything alone, the truth is none of us can.
Yeah.
Who do you think makes a road for you? Who makes a clothes? None of us do anything alone. We
Mhm.
all need
Mhm.
other people, and we also need other
Yeah.
people emotionally, right? And it doesn't matter
Yeah.
how strong you are, we still have that fundamental need. So part of
Yeah.
the healing happens in relationship with others, by being around other secure nervous system that can attune to you, that can respond to you, that can validate you, that can accept you, instead of doing the opposite. While a lot of these people happen is they get experience with judgment, right? The one that's anxious get told they're needy. That just reinforces, oh, there's something wrong with me. Imagine
Sure.
suddenly getting the respond, oh, I hear that you feel really anxious right now. What do you need from me to feel safe? Right?
Yeah.
Imagine the difference that has on the nervous system, to get
Yeah.
that over time. And then I think the last
Yeah.
component is that psychedelics does have a big role to play
Mhm.
and can actually rewire attachment systems, because, and this is what is so incredible that we are discovering now with the research and also practical implication, is
Yeah.
that in part of the brain, the frontal part, we create this construct of who we are, and it becomes
Mhm.
very fixed, that it's very hard to suddenly move and have flexibility of thinking both around ourselves and how we relate to others, which is why these strategies
Yeah.
played again and again. And
Yeah.
psychedelics actually, while it interconnect the brain much, much more than in a normal state of mind, it shut
Yeah.
down this particular part of the brain, which is a sense of this is who I am, which is the rigidity that makes us unable to change. That is shut down. And
Mhm.
when that's shut down, suddenly your other brain parts can connect. It's like the general who decides who you are and what you do and what you're aware of is go to
Yeah.
sleep. And all the others can now speak to each other and say, actually, this is not how I am. This was just a construct based on things I
Mhm.
was given and experienced. And I can be all these other things. And suddenly, when you have an embodied experience of that, it allows flexibility back in, and their nervous
Mhm.
system to adapt and change in very radical and fast ways, which is so
Yeah.
fascinating.
It really is fascinating. And, I think well, maybe my listeners might be a little bit more open, but I know a lot of people who see psychedelics from a lens of that's just recreational. That's just for people who want to see crazy colors, and they don't see it as something that can be healing. And just, quickly, before I throw this back to you, I use psychedelics myself for my own healing. That was part of how I got
Mhm.
sober. It helped me a lot, so
Mhm.
I understand how it can be healing. But maybe you can give yes, yes. So maybe you can give just a little bit of information for folks who maybe are a little bit more closed off to the idea of psychedelics. Just,
Of course.
you already gave a little bit of an intro, but maybe let's talk about the safety of it. Who could
Mm.
be using it, who can't, all of those kind of stipulations.
Amazing. This is so important to address. And,
Yeah.
I think it's good to have a balanced view because we tend to
Yeah.
either vilify something. It's again the Hollywood black and white. There's a villain and there's a
Yes.
good guy.
Of
That
course.
either this is a solution to everything or it's a villain of everything. And I think the truth
Yeah.
is always somewhere in the middle.
Agreed.
And I think the same applies to psychedelics, right? So it has some amazing healing properties. And we also have to recognize there was
Hmm.
a huge effort of misinformation by the US
Yes.
government who pressured
Yes.
the UN into banning this globally. And
Hmm.
there's now, and this has been disclosed. I don't believe in all these conspiracy theories. I'm very much a fact science kind of guy at the same time as
Absolutely.
having a spiritual element. But it has been proven that the main researcher that the US government funded and asked to produce research that discredited psychedelics actually
Hmm.
falsified his research. And
Yes.
what he gave to the animals that he said were getting harmed was not the psychedelics that he said he had done. So it was actually later discredited that it was false research purely to discredit
Yeah.
psychedelics. And there were all these myths that it could create holes in the brain or that people
Hmm.
would become highly addicted to it and ruin their future. And what we have seen now for literally thousands of research studies that has been done into psychedelics is that this is factually wrong. So
Yeah.
first of all, most psychedelics, so ketamine, which I wouldn't necessarily actually call a psychedelics, it's slightly different,
Hmm.
that can have addictive properties. And an interesting
Yeah.
thing is that's the one that's legalized in the US,
Yeah.
the one
Yes.
that can have potential addictive properties. Psilocybin and many of the other psychedelics have not shown any properties of being physically addictive at all. At
Hmm.
all. So
Hmm.
I think that's
Yeah.
first really important to say. And actually, they're being used to treat addiction now in trials and showing very,
Yes.
very promising and successful results, right?
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
there's also the other thing about overdose and deaths, right? If you know any
Hmm.
nurse, go ask them if lots of people are showing up in hospitals. There's literally millions of people taking MDMA,
Right.
LSD, magic
Yeah.
mushrooms in the US every single year. Go check out emergency department and see if it's flocked with those people. It's
Right.
not, right? There was a guy, actually, a UK scientist, who did a
Hmm.
really nice chart where they looked at the dangers of different compounds in society, both on individual harm and on societally harm. And the
Hmm.
interesting thing, psilocybin, which is a component in magic mushrooms, were at the very
Hmm.
bottom of this
Yeah.
chart, meaning the least harmful. And it's almost
Yeah.
impossible to overdose on magic mushrooms. You're literally going to
Yeah.
get physical sick before you overdose and die.
Right. Right.
There are a few precautions for sure. You have to watch out if you have certain blood pressure things, heart condition,
Hmm.
if you're taking
Hmm.
antidepressants that can interact with
Sure.
the same receptors. So you don't have
Sure.
a lot of impact. So there are definitely things you should be mindful, which is why I recommend people do it with a professional or somebody who knows what they're doing and can
Yeah.
screen, but done in the right environment and also in the right setting. So a lot of
Hmm.
people would do this at a festival and concert, and I would
Oh
not
God.
recommend this because it can be
Neither would
very
I.
overwhelming. Exactly.
Right.
And it can be very
Yeah.
psychologically harmful to do
Yeah.
that, but done in the right
Yeah.
setting with a safe person, right? And with somebody who knows how to screen, it's very safe. And in the trials, there has
Yeah.
pretty much been no adverse effect. Nobody gets
Yeah.
addictive. As people who take
Hmm.
in magic mushroom, they don't want to take
Hmm.
it next week. They don't want the next
Right.
month. Normally people are like, no, thank you, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think we also have to recognize this research, what it told us, and this is very fascinating, that
Hmm.
the most dangerous compounds are compounds that are legal. They are alcohol.
Alcohol.
You know
Yeah.
how many people alcohol kill every year in the United States?
Oh, thousands. Yeah.
Tobacco, right? And
Yes.
these are
Yes.
legalized. So the
Yes.
fear has been totally miscued by these campaigns that were done by the US government, in the 60s
Yes.
and 70s to try and create this enormous fear. And I think now we need a more balanced view that psychedelics
Yes.
has a hugely, hugely influenced part, and it's showing more potential than any other treatment in mental health have done at any
Yeah.
point in human history, right? And at the
Hmm.
same time, of course, we need to have safe use. So I'm not
Hmm.
advocating people go out and do this in a club or at a festival. And often when
Sure.
they buy things on the street, they don't know the purity of it. And that can be dangerous. and
Right.
also mixing different compounds. So you will have young kids who might take LSD and then they drink
Mm,
alcohol. And yes, mixing compounds, that can certainly be dangerous, right?
sure.
So
Yeah.
done in unsafe environments, yes, then a few
Hmm.
people have died and will die,
Yes.
but done in a safe environment with a safe person, it is very, very safe.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, first of all, giving those safety disclaimers, but also the history, because I feel like a lot of this, I don't want to call it hidden history necessarily, but it's
Mhm.
history that at least in the United States, we don't learn. And I didn't learn a lot of
Mhm.
this until I was doing my underground, oh my goodness, undergraduate thesis.
It is
Undergraduate
underground.
thesis. It is underground. My undergraduate thesis on the show Intervention. I don't know if you have that show in the UK. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's
I
a
haven't
show
seen
about
it.
people. Basically a show about people who are going through interventions for different addictions. And the
Mhm.
pattern that I noticed is that it was always alcohol, or heroin, or crack cocaine, but none of these psychedelics ever came up. And I started to research exactly what you picked up about the campaign against psychedelics, and why the US government basically try to suppress this. So I appreciate you bringing up that history. Now that we've talked about the disclaimers, we've talked about kind of some of those blockages around the way that we think about psychedelics. Let's talk about what it can do, because obviously it's not a silver bullet. There's still
Mhm.
work that needs to be done by the practitioner and by the person who's taking the psychedelic.
Absolutely. And this is where the
Yeah.
ideas of set and setting really comes in, and
Yeah.
also having a proportional view of what's going on. I had somebody contact me who just had a relationship breakup and say, "Oh,
Mm.
can you give me a psychedelic because I'm grieving and it's really hard."
Mm.
I said, "That's good." She said, "What do you mean it's good?" I said, "Grieving is a healthy, natural
Yeah.
response to have after a relationship breakup, and it's not a reason to take psychedelics, right?" So
Right.
this is
Right.
again why I think it's important to say it's not about whenever I have a problem, I take a psychedelic. However,
Right.
there are certainly cases where people have tried other things, normal therapy, they have done lots of other things, and they've been unable to move out of those destructive patterns and are still stuck right in a place where they can't break free.
Yeah.
Psychedelics in those instances can be extremely useful, right? Because they
Hmm.
break down the rigidity specifically of the mind and allow a new flexibility. It also creates something called neuroplasticity, which we naturally have
Mm.
a lot of as children, which is no
Yeah.
new neural connection can connect, right? And this is part
Yeah.
of what allows us to make very quick changes after having taken psychedelics. But it's also why the idea of just taking psychedelics is a huge misconception, because
Yes.
psychedelics doesn't heal or change you. Psychedelics is what we refer to as a neurological enhancer, meaning it
Mm.
enhances the processing of this neurological organism that we are and the ability to quickly change. But it then depends on what you do with that. So just
Yeah.
like with a child, a blank canvas, right, that have huge neuroplasticity, we can harm a child enormously because it has this neuroplasticity, but we can
Yeah.
also create amazing new networks that will serve it through life. And it's a bit the same. You have to look at it after a journey, which is why the
Mhm.
preparation, but also the integration is an absolutely key part,
Mhm.
because this is when we can make changes, but we can also create more harm. And why I
Mm.
say that is, if, part of what I often work with people on, if they want to do this, is I really work on, do they have a social support network in place that can support
Mhm.
them? What time can they take off? How can we eliminate different stress factors so they are not,
Sure.
influenced by lots of stress? Because if you go back to the same environment, the organism, which is us, will, adapt back to that environment. So we have
Sure.
to also make changes in the environment to be able to see long-term changes, right?
Yeah.
And I think these are really, really key elements that are often missed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting that you describe it that way, that they have this, psychedelic experience. Now there's this neuroplasticity, and there's almost like, it sounds like there's this kind of portion of time where it's really important to make sure they're in the right
Yes.
container to actually make positive changes. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's it, exactly. And we
Yeah.
don't know, it depends, slightly dependent on the compound, but an estimate is anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months. You have a really
Wow.
open gap window. And you also have to be extra careful. As I said, how we have restrictions on certain movies for children? Well, that's
Yes.
because we know when they're in this place of mind, they're very,
Yeah.
very highly influenced, right? And it's hard to
Yeah.
filter. Think about your brain being in this same state of mind for a while after. So you have to be more careful, right? Don't spend your night binge watching lots of nonsense, because that will be sucked in. Almost imagine it's like, for a period, you turn it into a sponge, and it's
Yes.
amazing because you can now
Yeah.
suck in all this newness. but be
Yeah.
really careful what that newness is. Don't sit and watch horror movies, because then you just primed your amygdala to become more fearful, right? And it might even
Right.
be harmful. So it's really what we do, and also understanding how the different psychedelics are useful in different ways. So MDMA seems to be quite useful, for example, for talk therapy or couple therapy, because it
Yeah.
doesn't really send you off into a different place where you hallucinate or where you see different
Mm-hmm.
visions. You're very
Mm-hmm.
present still, and you
Yeah.
can still process cognitively at the same time, which sometimes you can't
Yeah.
do as well with other psychedelics. But it
Yeah.
creates this open-heartedness. It calms down the fear center in your brain, which suddenly makes
Mm.
it possible to either look at traumas you couldn't do because they were too overwhelming, or to
Sure.
communicate things to your partner that you couldn't because all these defense mechanisms were blocking it, right? And
Yeah.
suddenly you can open this gate of vulnerable communication that seemed to have a lasting effect, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
while other tools can be really beneficial for individual work, like psilocybin magic mushrooms, are
Mm-hmm.
proving hugely effective for anxiety disorder, depression, PTSD, OCD. There's lots of research
Yeah.
happening, right? So it's a
Yeah.
really exciting time, I think.
It really is. So, when it comes to your particular practice and the retreats that do you pick certain substances or plant medicines depending on the person who is coming to you for assistance, or do you only work with one type of substance?
Well, so first of all, I just got to say that I don't supply any substances to anybody because, of
Sure,
course,
sure,
this is
sure.
illegal in the UK.
Sure.
So I just got to
Sure.
say that as a disclaimer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because people sometimes contact me and say, "Can you get me MDMA?" So the answer is no. Just for people out there, I cannot get you any substances, but I help
Understandable.
facilitate. I help
Yes.
facilitate the journey for them, right? The preparation,
Yes.
the integration,
Gotcha.
and make sure
Got
they're
it. Got
safe.
it.
That's kind of what I do, and it's a really good question. So I primarily work with psilocybin, magic
Yeah.
mushrooms. Or the people that I support work with that. And the reason for that choice is, first of all, it has the highest safety profile. As I
Mm-hmm.
said, it's almost impossible to overdose. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
I go through questionnaire with certain exclusions where there could be risk. But if you exclude that, it's very, very, very safe on a physical level, right? Very, very
Yeah.
safe. Um, and what you would tend to do is allow people to have a lower dose to see their tolerance, because it also depends
Mm-hmm.
on how receptive, how many serotonin receptor we have, which is what they connect to, how strong our experience is, and you don't want to overwhelm somebody, right? So
Sure.
it's good to start on a lower and see what is the response, and then you can always up it a little bit, right, when you know how they respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think psilocybin, because the safety profile, as I said, because there's zero addictive properties that seem to be at all physiologically around this compound. And also, just for me, this is more personal. There's something about something that grows in nature rather than
Mm-hmm.
something that's chemical manufactured, right? LSD
Yeah.
is manufactured, etc. MDMA, while magic mushrooms is something that literally grows out in the fields here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And again, I don't recommend people go pluck them themselves, because if you don't know what you're doing, you can also pick poisonous mushrooms.
Yes.
So again,
Yes.
I recommend, if that's what you want to do, deal with an expert who knows what they're doing and have done it for a long time.
Yes. No, that's a really good safety concern because, yes, all mushrooms are not created equal. There are some that will absolutely take you to see real God if you
That's right.
believe in that. So I wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier in the podcast. So when it comes to attachment theory and couples, do you ever work with couples at the same time, or do you prefer that one person go through this experience and then the other person?
I think both are helpful, actually, to do
Yeah.
both.
Yeah.
So that's my preference, because the fact is, we have to recognize whenever we come into a relationship, we
Hmm.
both bring a history, right?
Yeah.
And again, we don't need to be judgment. That's okay. We both had a history. And with that will be certain wounds that will play out and certain behavioral patterns. So it's important for each of us to have awareness of what they are, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it gets really hard to stop this cycle that couples might get stuck in, right? And then when
Yeah.
you have that individual awareness, if it's possible, it's not always that people want individual, right, work,
Mhm.
but in optimal conditions, that's what I would prefer, and then bring them together. Because when you suddenly
Mm.
have two people who are aware of their own strategies, who understand how to play out and impact the dynamic, it becomes much easier to start doing that work. It's not
Yeah.
always the case. People want that, and you can work with couples who don't do that. It just takes slightly longer, right? And then you help them
Mhm.
see the dance that they're often caught in. Because I say, when people come in, if you imagine a relationship being a dance, because it really is,
Yeah.
it's two
Yeah.
nervous systems that need to sense each other and move in sync and in flow. And when it
Yeah.
just flows, it looks sexy, it's fun, and we're
Yes.
having a good time, right? I know where
Yes.
you're moving, you know where I'm moving you, it feels good. But then suddenly, if we're listening to two different songs and we don't have the same beat, then it's
Yes.
not working. And I step on your toes and you're getting irritated and I'm getting frustrated. I can't get it right. And that's what then happens, right? They're no longer
Yeah.
listening to the same music. So they get out of tune when they dance. And this
Yeah.
is again, get them to recognize that it's not your partner that's the enemy. It's the dance. It's a cycle you're stuck in. And when
Yeah.
they can start externalize it, then they can come together, right? It's part of tribal culture. And every dictator have used this principle of
Yeah.
externalizing an enemy, but now we can use it in a good way, right? Of
Yeah.
making them realize it's a dance, it's a cycle that's an enemy, it's not your partner. And then that slows down normally escalation. And then we get to start looking at how these dynamics play out, right?
Yeah.
And then we get to the more vulnerable parts. What are the underlying attachment need you actually need? So let's say the avoidant man, the man might say, oh, you know, I can never get it right. This is a typical thing for an avoidant
Mm.
person to say because they learned as a
Mm.
child, whatever I do is not going to work. So they'll say, oh, I can't get it right anyway. And she will say, you know, if she's more anxious, oh, he never respond to me, he never communicate, right?
Right.
But when we get past the criticism and the pulling away, what is it? He is really
Mm.
scared that she will not
Mm.
respond and that he will not be accepted because they tend to have
Yeah.
been judged a lot, ignored a lot. He's terrified. And when he becomes aware, he can communicate that. When she become aware that all her criticism is actually about, I'm afraid of you not
Mm.
responding to me and I need to know you're here. But when that
Mm.
gets communicated in that way, it deactivates the defense mechanisms, right? Because
Yeah.
fear doesn't come online when it's not feeling attacked. And then we allow a new communication to suddenly unfold. And then I help
Mm.
them restructure that by now communicating that to each other. And now suddenly they get a new response. They learn, oh, I say something and the other person actually respond. Now we're creating the very model of secure attachment. And
Yeah.
basically what would happen between a securely attached parent and an infant, this is what you would see happen. Exactly this. A
Yeah.
bit for a need. I'm hungry, I'm tired, and the other person attuning and responding, and the child's nervous system calm down and feel safe. Now we
Mm.
recreate what that looks like in the adult organism, and they
Yeah.
can then come back to a secure base that they can then take forward together.
That is so beautiful. I mean, it's almost like having a do-over, like getting to
Mhm.
to correct what might not have gone the way that we would want earlier
Yes,
in life.
yes.
So this is going to be a really oddball question, but this just popped in as you were talking about this. Do these concepts, whether it's your psychedelic work or your work with couples, does this work with any other pairings, like, adult parent and adult child, two friends, two roommates, a boss and an employee? Can this work in other contexts?
Yes, it can. And
Yeah.
absolutely. Of course, again, just as a disclaimer, I would never do this with a child. Psychedelics, right?
Yes. Yes, that's
I
what I
just
said.
want to say that.
Adult
Yes,
child,
I get
adult
it.
parent. Yes, yeah, yeah.
I totally get it in the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And yes, it does. The same principles exactly work.
Yeah,
And also
yeah.
in friendships. And, there was even research, and I think this is very relevant to what's happening in the world today, where they did this and they got Palestinians and Israelis in together in the same room and they
Mm.
did ayahuasca to measure if it was possible to reduce animosity. And
Yeah.
guess what happened? It
Oh my God.
worked.
Yeah.
It worked
Yeah.
because the animosity exists in this part I described before, in the prefrontal part of the brain, the sense of identity. This is, I am Muslim and you are Jew. These things that distinguish and create difference between us. But when
Yeah.
psychedelics shut that down, we no longer see differences.
Yeah.
All we see is common humanity. And then you can no longer hate. Hate requires that we create a distance between us and say, oh, even
Yeah.
when you hear a lot of this stuff about men and women online and all this harshness that we have towards each other, instead of creating understanding of how we process the world and the needs we have, right?
Yeah.
And we create these differences that create animosity. But when that part shut down, animosity dissipate. And when we
Yeah.
calm the amygdala, the fear, then you no longer have these responses, and then nobody wants to harm each other. And the amazing
Yeah.
thing, these effects seem to be long lasting. So it works
Yeah.
in anything, in a friendship, in a parent child, even on global conflicts. This could work,
Mhm.
right?
Mm,
if it was accessible and something we were actually able to look at more. So yes, the potential is really, really incredible to change the
yeah.
world and how we live. And it also connects us more with nature, which is essential now when we're trying to save the
Mhm.
human planet, right? So
Yeah.
it does a lot of incredible things that I think has been suppressed for too long.
As you were saying all of this, what kept popping in for me was mission and purpose. And it almost sounds
Mhm.
like what you're doing is so much bigger than what it appears on the surface. Like, yes, you're a couples therapist. Yes, you help people with emotional healing through
Mhm.
psychedelic retreats, but it feels like there's something bigger going on here with you. And I know we're getting kind of close to the end, but I want
Mhm.
to make sure we spend a few minutes just talking about where you see all this going, what your ultimate mission is, what your ultimate purpose is. Like, tell
Mm.
us some more about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think you're right. There always is a bigger purpose. And I actually spoke to my friend who's in Berlin yesterday about this.
Yeah.
And, I also host ecstatic dances, which is a way for people to come together and move without alcohol, feel
Yes.
embodied contact with their bodies, and also create a sense of community. And what I
Yeah.
think we have lost is that a sense of community and connectedness in a
Yeah.
world where we have been fractured apart as individuals, where we have all these narratives of how we are different and why we shouldn't like each other, and how we're different nationalities, different colors, male or female,
Yeah.
different religions. There's so many things that are used to fragment our common humanity, right?
Yeah.
And this idea we are conditioned through school, through university, through work, that I win at the expense of you, because
Yeah.
only one of us can get a raise, only one of us can get into that university. And it's
Yeah.
very much this American culture on competitiveness, when
Yeah.
actually we are a species that thrive when we collaborate.
Yes.
Nobody
Yes.
has ever invented anything by themselves. When
Yeah.
they tell you about the guy who invented the light bulb, he didn't invent that by himself.
Hmm.
Steve Jobs didn't invent the iPhone by himself.
Yeah.
Everything we ever created was through collaboration. And
Yes.
this is what we need to come back to again. We need to come back to community, to collaboration, and break down the barriers that makes us feel different, and realize that actually we're the same.
Yeah.
Because on an attachment level, there's no difference between you and me. You
Yeah.
might see different pigments in our skin. Maybe we have
Hmm.
different genitals, but on an
Hmm.
attachment core level, we
Hmm.
want and need the same. We need to
Yeah.
know we are valued. We need
Yeah.
to know we're cared for, right? We need to know we are not alone. These needs are
Hmm.
fundamental, and that's what we all share as a
Yeah.
common humanity. And if we can come together in that, then we don't want to fight anymore. Then we don't
Yeah.
have to be so hostile towards each other. Then we can actually
Yeah.
start being compassionate and realizing the different sufferings that we all experience, and that your suffering is my suffering and my suffering is your suffering. Because when we let
Hmm.
people suffer, they start doing harmful things. And when we're able
Hmm.
to intervene and make them feel part of a community, they don't do harmful things.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you for that. I just want to let that sit for a second. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, I really, as you were saying that, I was like kind of feeling myself tear up, because you're absolutely right. I feel like we are living in a time where we're highly disconnected. We feel like we're more connected, and I don't want to. The internet has done a lot of great thing. It has connected us in ways that we didn't have before. But in a way, I almost feel like we're kind of escaping into our own little pods. And we need community. We need connection with each other. We need connection with nature. We need to feel like we're embedded in community,
Yes.
in connection with other people. That's vital. And there's tons of
Yes.
studies. If anybody wants to look into the science of this, including criminology, has tons of studies about what happens when people don't feel like they are a part of a community, as you
Yes.
alluded to. You are absolutely right
Yes.
about this. I guess, let's just talk about how people can work with you, where they can find your work, if this resonates with them, if they want to learn more, if they want to see if they're a good candidate for your couples therapy, your psychedelic work, or ecstatic dance. How can they find you, and how would you like to work with people?
Yeah, of course. Maybe we can put the links below in the description. But I think
Absolutely.
the main
Yeah.
way is they can go to Sense. Sen stand for the groundedness, and sensor for sensation, meaning the body. So groundedness in the body. And
Yeah.
that's where I offer more on couple therapy and also individual therapy with people who are interested in that.
Yeah.
Psychedelicmedicine.earth is where I help guide people on how to use psychedelics in a safe and consciously aware way, and a
Hmm.
mindful way, right? In a way that can actually benefit them long term. And
Yeah.
ecstaticdance.earth is where people can come if they obviously live in the UK, around London, and they want to go out and move and build community. And as you said, community is really at the essence of everything we do, and so it should be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas. This was such an amazing conversation. I learned so much. I am so blown away by everything you do, and I just appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you so much for creating this platform for your listeners. I think that's really amazing.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Highly Spiritual Person podcast. I really hope you found this conversation inspiring and uplifting. If you did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more updates. And remember, sharing is caring, so if you think others would benefit from this content, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family. We'll be back with more exciting content, so stay tuned and stay curious.